What's up guys, Rosh here and welcome to All About Climate. So today we'll be revisiting everyone's favourite fake university and conservative media network, PragerU. Now their guest speaker in this video is Danish political scientist and renowned climate contrarian Bjorn Lomborg. If you haven't heard of him, Bjorn has written several books which throw doubt over the severity of climate change and question the wisdom of policies designed to address it. His overall position is basically that climate change is not that bad, and drastic actions designed to address it are unwise. Indeed, he has particularly strong views about renewable energy, which we'll get to later. But first, let's see what Bjorn has to say.
Carbon emissions are rising, and faster than most scientists predicted. But many climate change alarmists seem to claim that all climate change is worse than expected. This ignores that much of the data is actually more encouraging than expected.
Okay, so Bjorn's argument is essentially that climate change isn't as bad as expected, and apparently there's data to back this up, which is great. We can get stuck into it later. But first, I'd like to draw your attention to his assertion that climate change alarmists claim that all climate change is worse than expected. Now, aside from the fact that climate alarmist is both a loaded and ambiguous term, I've never heard anyone claim that all climate change is worse than expected, so I'm not sure who Bjorn's attempting to refute here. Such people may well exist, but they're certainly not a majority. Maybe I'm just being overly cynical, but it feels like Bjorn's attacking a straw man. I'll let you decide. Anyway, let's get back to Bjorn.
Yes, Arctic sea ice is melting faster than models expected, but models also predicted that Antarctic sea ice would decrease, yet Antarctic sea ice is increasing.
Yes, it's true that Arctic sea ice is declining faster than models projected, and that Antarctic sea ice increased, which might seem counterintuitive, but a 2018 study suggests that ocean convection may be to blame. By temporarily trapping heat deep in the ocean, it allowed surface waters to cool and for sea ice to grow despite global warming. If this study is correct, the sea ice will begin to decline once the trapped heat is released back to the surface. But I digress. The real question here is how significant these sea ice gains are. After all, Bjorn gives us the impression that the gains in Antarctica and the losses in the Arctic are more or less equivalent, which would be encouraging. Except, in reality, Arctic losses are much larger than the Antarctic gains, so the planet as a whole has still lost sea ice. And to make matters worse, Arctic sea ice is generally much older and thicker than in the Antarctic, which makes it considerably harder to replace. And to make matters even worse, the long-term increases in Antarctic sea ice have rapidly reversed since Bjorn published his video in 2016, erasing the gains of the previous decades and dropping to new lows. An observation which happens to support the idea that ocean convection was temporarily trapping heat below the surface. Obviously, Bjorn couldn't have known this at the time, but even accounting for that, the picture was much worse than he made out.
Yes, sea levels are rising, but the rise is not accelerating. If anything, two recent papers, one by Chinese scientists published in January 2014 and the other by US scientists published in May 2013, have shown a small decline in the rate of sea level increase.
Now, credit where credit's due, Bjorn has cited his sources, so let's take a closer look. Here's the first study, and straight away it becomes obvious that the authors were looking at a fairly short and very recent period of time. Now, while there's nothing inherently wrong with this, it does make it hard to draw meaningful conclusions about long-term trends. Anyway, their data does show a slight deceleration in sea level rise since 2004, but the authors suggest this is only a temporary slowdown caused by natural ocean cycles like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. As the term oscillation implies, these cycles generally switch or oscillate between two phases, a warming phase and a cooling phase. And because water expands when it warms and contracts when it cools, this affects sea level. Of course, the oceans as a whole are still getting warmer, and the ice caps are still melting, so sea levels will still rise regardless. But these cycles of expansion and contraction become superimposed on the long-term trend. So as the oceans expand during the warming phase, sea level rise appears to accelerate, while during the cooling phase it appears to decelerate as the contracting oceans put the brakes on the effects of global warming. And this is basically what the study suggests is going on. In other words, the deceleration that Bjorn is talking about is a temporary slowdown and almost certainly not a long-term trend. Indeed, the authors even explicitly say that sea level rise is likely to accelerate again in the future, and Bjorn's second study also supports this conclusion. And on top of all of that, if we look at the big picture over the long term rather than the short term, sea level rise does in fact appear to be accelerating. So Bjorn's claim, though technically not entirely incorrect, is very misleading.
We're often being told that we're seeing more and more droughts, but a study published in March 2014 in the journal Nature actually shows a decrease in the world's surface that has been afflicted by droughts since 1982.
Okay, let's talk about droughts. Unlike sea levels, where you only have to think about factors affecting ocean volume, droughts are much more complex, which makes projecting future drought in response to global heating much harder. But the overall conclusion of most hydrological models is that a warming planet amplifies extremes at both ends of the spectrum. The dry areas get drier and the wet areas get wetter. Obviously, that's a massive oversimplification, but honestly, this topic has enough material for its own video, so I won't go too deep here. The point is that scientists expect that some areas will have more droughts while others will have less, so the global trend on its own doesn't give us the full picture. Think about it, if half the world got twice as dry and the other half got twice as wet, then these effects might cancel each other out and result in an unchanged global average. But the ramifications at the local level would be huge. Already water-stressed areas might be pushed into droughts they can't recover from, and wetter areas could see more intense flooding. And actually, there's already evidence that this phenomenon of dry areas getting drier and wet areas getting wetter is already happening. So implying that climate change isn't having much effect on droughts is just wrong.
Facts like these are important because a one-sided focus on worst-case stories is a poor foundation for sound policies.
Yeah, and a one-sided focus on best-case scenarios is just as problematic.
Hurricanes are likewise used as an example of things getting worse. But look at the US, where we have the best statistics. If we adjust for population and wealth, hurricane damage during the period of 1900 to 2013 actually decreased slightly.
Anyone else think that hurricane damage in the US, when adjusted for population and wealth, is a really weird metric for judging whether hurricanes are getting worse? It doesn't tell us anything about hurricane frequency or intensity, which is what we're really talking about here. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that the number of tropical storms in the North Atlantic and Central Pacific has increased over the last 40 years, but at the moment, it's not possible to say what role, if any, climate change has played. Indeed, this is an area of ongoing scientific research, and the jury is very much still out. There are multiple studies investigating this, and their conclusions are often contradictory, but the prevailing wisdom is that we can expect minimal changes in hurricane frequency and possibly even a decrease in the number of storms each year. But when they do form, they are likely to be more intense. Again, the science on this is worthy of its own video, so I won't go into too much detail here, but the basic idiot-proof explanation is that hurricanes and other tropical storms get their energy from the ocean. As the planet warms, the oceans hold more energy, and with more energy available, storms should either become more frequent, more intense, or both. And although there are no discernible long-term trends, the last few years have seen repeated, record-breaking Atlantic storm seasons which have caused incredible damage throughout the Caribbean and North America. It could all just be coincidental, natural variability rather than climate change, but I would argue that the fact that we don't know exactly how a warmer planet affects storms, and the fact that there's a good chance that it will make them worse, is a pretty good reason to err on the side of caution and try to limit warming as much as possible. But that's just me.
At the UN Climate Conference in Lima, Peru, in December 2014, attendees were told that their countries should cut carbon emissions to avoid future damage from storms like Typhoon Hagupit, which hit the Philippines during the conference, killing at least 21 people and forcing more than 1 million into shelters. Yet the trend for strong typhoons around the Philippines have actually declined since 1950, according to a study published in 2012 by the Journal of Climate.
Yeah, that's true. Indeed, some of you probably noticed that the same study we looked at earlier, which revealed an increase in North Atlantic storms, also revealed a decrease in the number of storms in the western North Pacific, i.e. where the Philippines are. Though this does make me wonder why Bjorn only focuses on the latter trend and ignores the increase in storms elsewhere. But anyway, it seems that while there may not be a discernible global trend, there has been a distinct shift in the global pattern of tropical storms, and a recent study suggests that their range is likely to expand as the planet warms, endangering cities like New York, Beijing and Tokyo. But for now, the trend remains unclear and the role of human activity uncertain. As before, I would suggest this should be cause for caution and not a reason to assume that climate change is better than expected.
Again, we're told that all things are getting worse, but the facts don't support this. This does not mean global warming is not real or a problem, but the one-sided story of alarmism makes us lose focus.
But who exactly is saying that all things are getting worse? I'm certainly not, but it is undeniable that many things are. And even if Bjorn's claims about sea ice, droughts, sea levels and hurricanes were all factually accurate, which they're not, it doesn't change the fact that, on balance, climate change poses serious threats to humanity. Global water and food security are already under threat. The frequency of intense rainfall, storms and flooding is tangibly rising. Heat waves are becoming more likely, and that's exacerbating wildfires all over the world. The point is, many things are getting worse, and in attempting to criticise overly pessimistic depictions of climate change, Bjorn is doing the opposite and presenting an overly optimistic one. And look, I'm sure he might respond by saying that he's just presenting the other side. That of course there are many negatives to climate change, but that in order to be fair, we should look at the positives, or at least the not so negatives. And I agree, we should. But that shouldn't come at the cost of misrepresenting science to imply conclusions which are not scientifically tenable. And if the claims Bjorn has made so far are the best he has to support his argument that climate change is
more encouraging than expected,
then he's on very shaky ground.
If we want to help the world's poor, who are the most threatened by natural disasters, it's less about cutting carbon emissions than it is about pulling them out of poverty. The best way to see this is to look at the world's death from natural disasters over time. In the Oxford University database for death rates from floods, extreme temperatures, droughts and storms, the average in the first part of last century was more than 130 dead every year per million people. Since then, the death rates have dropped 97% to a new low in the 2010s of less than 4 per million. The dramatic decline is mostly due to economic developments that help nations withstand catastrophes.
Right, so this is basically the crux of Bjorn's argument. We must lift poor countries out of poverty so they can better withstand the effects of extreme weather. This is a message I'd be on board with if it wasn't also implied that it was an alternative to reducing carbon emissions. Why not both? Sure, many poor countries might not be in a position to do so yet, but, well, they don't really have to, because they aren't the ones producing most of the world's CO2. Rich countries are, and I don't think enough people appreciate just how disproportionate this rich-poor divide is. If you live in the US, for example, your lifestyle currently produces twice as much carbon as someone living in China, and 20 times as much carbon as someone living in Africa. Given how much more CO2 wealthy countries produce, it's perfectly possible for them to massively reduce global carbon emissions without the poorest nations having to do a thing. Rich countries also have the resources to decarbonise themselves with minimal disruption. For example, the UK cut its emissions in half since 1990 and still managed to grow GDP. Of course, eventually, poorer countries must also eliminate their emissions, but there's good news there too, because renewable energy is becoming cheaper and more efficient by the day, and in many cases, is already competitive with fossil fuels. In other words, it's perfectly possible to make massive cuts to global emissions while also pulling poor countries out of poverty. Indeed, if we don't, climate change is likely to exacerbate poverty further, which, as Bjorn just proved, massively reduces their capacity to withstand natural disasters. So it's not a case of either or, we have to do both.
A well-meaning environmentalist might argue that because climate change is a reality, why not ramp up the rhetoric and focus on the bad news to make sure the public understands its importance? But that's exactly what we've done for the past 20 years. Yet despite dramatic headlines, apocalyptic documentaries, and annual climate summits, carbon emissions continue to rise, especially in rapidly developing countries like India, China, and many African nations.
It is strange when you think about it. Governments have been aware that CO2 emissions were warming the planet for over 40 years, and yet despite that we've made almost no progress towards reducing them. Obviously, this has nothing to do with the fact that oil companies and conservative media have spent the last 4 decades lobbying against climate action, downplaying the dangers of climate change, cherry-picking the science, spreading disinformation to the public, and calling anyone who advocates for emission reductions an alarmist. No. Our lack of progress is definitely because of those fear-mongering environmentalists. Who'd have thought?
Alarmism has encouraged the pursuit of a one-sided climate policy of trying to cut carbon emissions by subsidizing wind farms and solar panels. Yet today, according to the International Energy Agency, only about 0.4% of global energy consumption comes from solar photovoltaics and windmills. And even with exceptionally optimistic assumptions about future deployment of wind and solar, the International Energy Agency expects that these energy forms will provide a minuscule 2.2% of the world's energy by 2040. In other words, for at least the next 2 decades, solar and wind energy are simply expensive, feel-good measures that will have an imperceptible climate impact. Instead, we should focus on investing in research and development of green energy to lower its costs. So everyone will want it, including China and India.
Okay, so first of all, China and India are both in the top 5 countries in the world for renewable energy capacity, and China has been the leading investor in solar technologies for a decade. I think it's fair to say that they already want green energy. Now, let's look at Bjorn's figures. Bjorn's video was published in 2016, so I'm assuming he used the most up-to-date IEA figures, which would have been their 2015 World Energy Outlook. And although I couldn't confirm these exact numbers, they do seem plausible if a tad on the low side. So let's assume that he's right, and that solar and wind only accounted for 0.4% of global energy demand in 2015, and that the best case projection saw them grow to just 2.2% by 2040. That does sound pretty bad, but fortunately there's good news. As of 2020, solar and wind have already surpassed Bjorn's exceptionally optimistic projection 20 years ahead of schedule, accounting for over 3% of global energy supply. And if we look at electricity consumption, their share is much higher. Granted, it's still small, but you have to remember that this technology is still in its infancy. It's the equivalent of looking at cars versus horses in the early 20th century. The relatively low numbers are in no way reflective of their potential. And so far, the data shows that solar and wind are growing exceedingly quickly. So fast that, if Bjorn's figures were correct, they grew by a factor of 8 in just 5 years, 5 times faster than Bjorn's apparently best case scenario. And actually, renewables surpassing expectations has been something of a trend recently. Over the last decade, the IEA has consistently underestimated their growth potential, which you can see in this graphic. The coloured lines are the IEA's past projections for solar, and the black line is what actually happened. And just as a point of comparison, here are some climate model projections, also compared to reality. I think I know which looks more reliable. Anyway, the point is, renewables have consistently outperformed even the most optimistic expectations for 20 years straight. And as we saw earlier, they're becoming increasingly efficient, affordable, and competitive. And even the IEA now projects them to account for nearly half of global electricity by 2040, which, given their record of vastly underestimating growth in renewables, is reason to be optimistic. In short, Bjorn is painting an unfairly pessimistic and extremely misleading picture of solar and wind by writing them off as useless, and the data simply does not support his conclusion. Which reminds me of something he said earlier.
Facts like these are important because a one-sided focus on worst-case stories is a poor foundation for sound policies.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
We urgently need a more balanced climate conversation if we ought to make sensible choices and pick the right climate policy that can actually help fix climate change. I'm Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center.
So it seems we've covered all of Bjorn's arguments. And yes, we do need a more balanced conversation. But that conversation has to be based on evidence. All the evidence, not just cherry-picked examples which support the conclusions we want to make. Unfortunately, in an attempt to counter so-called worst-case claims about climate change, Bjorn went to the opposite extreme and presented an unrealistically optimistic and equally misleading view. He consistently cherry-picked oddly specific case studies in order to support dubious conclusions which simply aren't supported within the wider scientific context. To his credit, unlike other contrarians, he never tried to dispute whether climate change was happening or whether humans were the cause, which is progress, I guess. But instead, he focused on downplaying its negative effects and discrediting the policies enacted to address it. And actually, this is something which research shows is becoming more common, namely climate contrarians shunning outright science denial in favour of attacking climate solutions. I suspect that over the coming years, as the effects of climate change become increasingly obvious, we will hear more of this line of argument. So hopefully, this video will help some of you to better identify and better counter some of the subtler and arguably more persuasive arguments used by people like Bjorn. So, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to support the channel, then help the algorithm with a like, a comment and a share. And if you want to see more of my content, then don't forget to smash that subscribe button. A lot of time and effort goes into these videos, so I always appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and until next time, goodbye.